You've probably said it before, maybe as a joke. Back when people thought the Earth was flat, you picture torch-lit ships sailing toward a horizon that just ends, terrified sailors, priests warning that the ocean spills off the edge of the world into nothing. It feels obvious, it feels safe to laugh at, but the real answer is far stranger than the joke because almost none of it actually happened. Here's the uncomfortable part. The people you're picturing right now, the ones cowering in fear of falling off a flat world, mostly never existed. Not the sailors, not the priests, not the terrified crowds. You inherited this image from somewhere, but where? Start with the Greeks, because that's where this story actually begins. By around 500 BCE, educated Greek thinkers already accepted that the Earth was a sphere, not a guess, not a myth, an observation built from watching the world carefully. Ships disappearing hull first over the horizon, the curved shadow the Earth casts on the moon during a lunar eclipse, the fact that the North Star sits lower in the sky the further south you travel. Small clues, consistent clues, all pointing the same direction. Then, around 240 BCE, a Greek scholar named Eratosthenes did something that should genuinely astonish you. He was the head librarian at the Great Library of Alexandria, and he heard something curious. At noon on the summer solstice, in the city of Siena, sunlight fell straight down a deep well and lit the water at the bottom. No shadow at all. But on that same day in Alexandria, a vertical stick still cast a shadow. Why would the same sun, at the same moment, behave differently in two places? Eratosthenes measured that shadow's angle, about 7 degrees. He knew the rough distance between the two cities. And using nothing but geometry, sunlight, and a stick in the ground, he calculated the circumference of the entire planet. His answer was somewhere between roughly 39,000 and 46,000 kilometers, depending on which ancient unit of measurement historians use to convert his work. The actual circumference of Earth is about 40,075 kilometers. He was startlingly close, using a stick, in 240 BCE. Now it's worth being honest here, because the full picture is more interesting than a simple story of Greek genius versus universal ignorance. Some earlier civilizations really did imagine a flat world. Ancient Mesopotamian cosmology described a disc-shaped Earth floating on a cosmic ocean. Some early Egyptian religious texts imagined the sky as a goddess arched over a flat land. Those weren't failures of intelligence. They were reasonable conclusions drawn from limited evidence, built centuries before anyone had the tools or the accumulated observations to test them properly. The flat Earth idea wasn't stupidity, it was simply an earlier stage of a very long investigation. What actually happened next matters more than either extreme. The Greek astronomical tradition didn't stay a fringe theory. It became the working assumption of an entire scientific and navigational culture. The astronomer Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century CE, built an entire system of maps and star tables, assuming a spherical Earth. And that system got used by sailors and cartographers for well over 1,000 years afterward. Round Earth geometry wasn't some obscure footnote. It was baked into the actual tools people used to cross oceans. So, if the ancient Greeks already knew this, and knew it well enough to measure the planet and build navigational systems on top of it, where did the flat Earth myth even come from? This is where the story takes its first real turn. It didn't disappear with the Greeks. Knowledge of a spherical Earth carried forward through Roman scholars and then through the medieval period that people love to imagine as a dark age of ignorance. A monk named Bede, writing in England around 700 CE, described the Earth as round in his astronomical writings, treating it as settled fact. By the High Middle Ages, spherical Earth wasn't some fringe idea whispered by outsiders. It was standard material taught in European university curricula, alongside astronomy and mathematics. Educated people across the medieval world, monks, scholars, navigators, largely accepted a round Earth as a given. By the 13th century, the Italian scholar and theologian Thomas Aquinas casually referenced a spherical Earth in his philosophical writings, treating it the way you'd treat a basic fact in a textbook today, something so settled it barely needed defending. University students across Europe encountered diagrams of a round Earth in their astronomy lessons centuries before Columbus ever boarded a ship. This wasn't controversial knowledge whispered among a small elite. It was ordinary curriculum. So when did the myth of a terrified, flat Earth-believing medieval world actually take hold? Here's where it gets genuinely strange, and this is the part that should catch you off guard. The myth is mostly a 19th century invention. Not medieval, not ancient, modern. A large part of the blame traces back to a writer named Washington Irving. In 1828, Irving published a biography of Christopher Columbus. It was marketed as history, but large sections were fiction, dramatized to make a better story. In it, Irving invented a scene where Columbus faces down a council of terrified churchmen who insist he'll sail off the edge of the world. It never happened. The real debate Columbus had with scholars was about the size of the Earth, not its shape. Everyone already agreed the planet was round. The actual disagreement was over distance, and on that argument, Columbus was the one who was wrong. His critics had the better math. But Irving's fictional scene was vivid, dramatic, and endlessly repeatable. It got copied into textbooks. It got repeated in classrooms. It hardened into something people simply accepted as fact, the same way a rumor calcifies the more times it gets retold. The historian Jeffrey Burton Russell traced this entire process in his 1991 book, Inventing the Flat Earth: Columbus and Modern Historians. Russell went back through centuries of medieval texts, sermons, scientific writings, and found almost no evidence that flat Earth belief was ever widespread among educated medieval people. What he found instead was a 19th century story, built partly to make science look heroic, standing bravely against a superstitious past that had been exaggerated to make the contrast feel more dramatic. The paleontologist and science historian Stephen Jay Gould reached the same conclusion from a different angle. In an essay examining the origins of the myth, Gould pointed out that the flat Earth story served a useful cultural purpose in the 1800s. It let science position itself as a heroic force triumphing over ignorance and religious dogma. A round Earth discovered by brave rationalists, opposed by frightened flat Earth believers. It's a satisfying narrative. It just isn't a true one. There's a related confusion worth clearing up here because you've probably tangled these two stories together without realizing it. The famous conflict between Galileo and the Church in the 17th century wasn't about the shape of the Earth at all. Nobody in that dispute doubted the planet was round. The actual fight was over heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun rather than the Sun orbiting the Earth. That's a real historical conflict, with real stakes and real consequences for Galileo. But it gets frequently blurred together with the flat Earth myth and casual retellings. Two separate scientific disputes collapsed into one vague memory of the church versus science, even though they involved different questions, different centuries, and different levels of actual controversy at the time. Think about what that actually means. An entire chapter of history, one you were probably taught as fact, was constructed generations after the events it claims to describe, in order to flatter the people telling the story. Why does that particular kind of myth spread so easily? This is where it stops being ancient history and starts being about you. You do this too. Not with the shape of the planet, but with the shape of the past in general. It feels good to imagine earlier generations as less intelligent than you. It makes progress feel inevitable, and it makes your own current beliefs feel like the obvious endpoint of a long climb out of ignorance. That feeling is comfortable. It's also, most of the time, wrong. Consider how often you accept a simplified version of history because it confirms something you already wanted to believe. Medieval doctors were superstitious quacks, so modern medicine looks miraculous by comparison. Ancient people were terrified of natural events, so modern science looks heroic by comparison. Past generations were universally sexist, or universally violent, or universally ignorant, which conveniently makes the present look like an obvious moral upgrade. Some of that is true in places. Much of it is flattened, exaggerated, simplified into a story that centers you as the smart one. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a version of presentism, the tendency to judge the past using the assumptions and knowledge of the present, then feel superior for the comparison. It's not a formal diagnosis, it's closer to a habit of mind. And it's remarkably persistent because it feels less like a bias and more like common sense. It shows up in smaller ways too, not just in grand historical myths. You do it when you assume an older relative's caution around new technology comes from ignorance rather than earned experience. You do it when you assume a decision made decades ago in a completely different economic or social context must have been foolish simply because you're viewing it with information nobody at the time actually had. History rarely rewards that kind of hindsight as much as it feels like it should. Here's the mirror moment. The next time you scroll past a headline claiming some surprising new discovery, ask yourself a slightly different question than the one you'd normally ask. Not, is this true? But does this make me feel flattering about my own moment in history? Because that specific feeling, the pleasant little rush of feeling more enlightened than the people who came before you, is exactly the feeling that let a fictional scene from a Columbus biography survive for almost 2 centuries as accepted fact. The ancient Greeks measured the earth using a shadow and a stick. Math, even a well-educated child today could follow. Medieval scholars taught it as settled fact in university lecture halls. The image of a terrified flat earth society was built centuries later, not because evidence demanded it, but because a good story about heroic modern science needed a superstitious villain to defeat. So, go back to that joke. Back when people thought the earth was flat. Say it again if you want, but notice this time exactly whose ignorance you were laughing at. It was never really the ancient world's. It was always your own about the ancient world, quietly handed down by a storyteller in 1828 who needed a better ending for his book. The more we learn about the past, the better we understand ourselves. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Phoenix Primeval for more fascinating stories from history, science, and human evolution. Thanks for watching.